In order to create the airbag, we're going to have to start creating some surfaces. To do this, we're going to need to learn a little bit about how to create surfaces and how to control the geometry of those surfaces. Everything is going to come down to either sketches or surrounding reference geometry, whether it's solids or surfaces. So to create this surface from scratch, we're going to have to create some sketches and some base surfaces to help drive that shape. To do this, I'm going to start by creating a sketch on my front plane. The reason I like to create a sketch on my front plane is because I can create a line looking at our sketch picture that intersects with our origin and is the length of the top section of our airbag, this lighter section here we see. I want to go ahead and fix the endpoints again because we don't have dimensions and end this sketch. The reason I drew that on our front plane is because this is our only sketch picture here. We don't have any other reference images to go by. So now when I create a sketch on our right plane, I can either use this line as a reference, or I can select that sketch and say convert entities and bring that into my current sketch. This way, if we hide that sketch, you can see there is now a line in our active sketch. I can convert that to construction and use that for the duration of this sketch. So now I'm going to create some reference lines and create some horizontal lines from the endpoint. And it's important to note that you don't need to create these lines. You could do this with references, but a lot of times when we get started, it's easier to visualize this by looking at these lines rather than the imaginary references that are created between endpoints. Now I want to create an arc. I'm going to go from both of these points, kind of give this an arbitrary curvature here. Next, we need to apply some dimensions. Now, because we don't have a horizontal reference sketch, we're going to have to guess at these dimensions based on images we've seen. So I'm going to give this a 40 millimeter dimension. I'm going to give this bottom line a 35 millimeter dimension. I'm going to give this arc an arbitrary number of 400 millimeters. Once we actually create a sketch and create our extruded surfaces, we can kind of judge to make sure that this curvature is accurate. I want to make sure both the upper and lower horizontal lines are construction, so we're only dealing with this arc that we created. We can exit this sketch and we can create an extruded surface based on this sketch. I'm going to use an arbitrary number of 100 millimeters and make sure it goes away from our part. The reason we're using an extruded sketch here is because we want to make sure when we mirror our airbag across that right plane, just like we did with the base of our steering wheel, that we have a nice transition here. We don't want to have a seam in the middle of our steering wheel when we know that it's nice and smooth in reality. So we're using what I like to call a helper surface. The next thing we want to do is use our top plane, start a new sketch, and then use our convert entities dropdown and something called intersection curve. Intersection curve allows you to use the current sketch plane, select a face, hit OK, and it's going to create a line based on the intersection between that face and the sketch plane. Now we can select this line and convert it to construction geometry. And when we look at this sketch normal, we have that line as a reference for the rest of our geometry. From this point, we can create a spline starting at this point and going somewhere out here arbitrary in space. I'm going to hit escape to exit that spline and start controlling its geometry. The first thing I want to do is select that intersection curve and control select our line and apply a tangency here. Now, one important thing to note when controlling spline geometry, you have a few options. What you see here, the dashed gray line, is something called the control polygon. There are options in SolidWorks to turn this on as a standard means of controlling your spline. You can also right-click on your spline and display the control polygon or hide it. The handles are only activated once you apply a relation or you grab them. You can see this one here is still gray, so if I drag this handle out, it moves along and the geometry that's created is based on the weight of this handle. You can apply dimensions to these handles. For instance, I can apply a weight to this handle of 300 millimeters. And then I can come back and I can grab this other handle and start moving this around and create some extra geometry. Now, I don't like to induce too much curvature into my geometry at first. I like to keep it fairly simple. But one thing you can do is create an angular reference here. So we could say 145 degrees. We can give this a weight as well and say 120 millimeters. We can give this a location based on its dimension away from the origin. We can give it a vertical dimension of 18 millimeters. Now we have that point located out in space. And of course, these numbers are arbitrary because we don't have any reference for this curvature. So I'm just doing my best to kind of estimate what the curvature of this airbag is going to look like. From this point, we can exit the sketch, and now we want to create a boundary surface. Boundary surfaces are great because you can use a number of different inputs to create the output surface. For instance, in this case, our direction 1 is going to be the edge of that extruded surface we created. Our direction 2 is going to be that sketch spline. Now at this point, we want to go ahead and apply some relations. For edge 1, this none drop-down box, we want to go ahead and apply tangency to face. We could also apply a curvature to face, but because of our sketch that we created, the spline we applied a tangency to, we don't actually have a curvature relation with that curvature of the face. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this as tangency, and we have the option to control the influence of this relation. If I drag this up to 100%, it's not going to make a whole lot of difference here because we have this spline controlling our direction too. So in this case, I'm going to leave it at 0. For our sketch, we're a little bit more limited as to what kinds of relations we can apply. If we look at the dropdown, we have the option to apply a direction vector or normal to profile. In our case, I'm going to leave it as none and OK this. This looks like a good place to take a break. That concludes creating the airbag part 1.